Okay, welcome back. This is part 5 of this shed build, which is to put these rafters on. And I'm pretty happy with how they came together. But for those of you who are aware of what an ID10T error is, you'll see one of those in this video. For those of you who are not familiar with that, you'll learn what that is today. Okay, so let's jump in and see how this came together. And I'll start by cutting these rafter boards to the right angle. My roof is going to have a 7/12 pitch, so I'm just using the speed square here to mark a line for a 7/12 pitch roof. Now the speed square will also tell you for each pitch of roof what the degree of angle is for your cut. And you can see here that a 7/12 pitch is right at about a 30-degree angle. And since I was going to be using my miter saw for this cut, I was simply marking a line to see if it matched the 30-degree angle on my saw, and it did. So this shed will have 7 sets of rafters, so 14 individual boards that need to be cut, which means 28 cuts. So once I got that angle set up, this became a rinse and repeat process. And this is where the miter saw comes in handy. Not only is it speedy, but it also helps with each of those cuts being uniform, which is a big goal with these rafters, wanting these all to be uniform. Okay, after a quick water break, get back to cutting. Now there's no reason to show you all 28 cuts, but I did think this was a pretty good cut montage here. And next it's time to cut the gussets, which will be used to connect the 2 rafter boards together. I'm cutting from this 7/16 OSB. Now, this is where things get exciting because of the way the geometry works out. So the 7/12 pitch, which results in a 30-degree angle cut, then creates a 30-30-120 triangle for this gusset, which means 3 of them put together results in a 60-60-60 triangle. And the reason why that's important is because these gussets share edges, which results in shared cuts, which results in lesser cuts, which is more efficient. Given the amount of time this shed is taking me, I need all the help I can get. Now, of the 7 sets of rafters, 5 of them will have 2 gussets, 1 on each side, and then the 2 on the end, or the gable rafters, they'll have 1 each. So I needed a total of 12 gussets. Okay, so the next step is to create a jig for connecting each set of rafter boards so that all 7 sets of rafters are uniform. So I fit 2 of the rafter boards based on the angle on top of a piece of OSB, and then I screwed these blocks into the OSB to create the jig. Now, the gussets will be attached to the rafters using nails, and I'm temporarily screwing this set together for the next step, which is to mark the location of the bird's mouth in a dry run. Now, I did the math on a 7/12 pitch roof to see where the bird's mouth should be, but never having done this before, I just felt better doing it this way. So I'm going to use this homemade plumb bob, which is basically kite string and a nut. I'm going to use this to center the rafter so that I can measure where the bird's mouth cut will be. Now, the siding I'm using is 3/8 of an inch thick, so I'm leaving a little bit extra room out here. So back to the speed square, this time to mark where the heel cut would be in the bird's mouth. Now there's an acceptable range at how high up this line your heel cut can be. I'm starting with 1/3 of the way up, and I'll go from there. Staying hydrated here. Okay, so I'm using a circular saw to start the bird's mouth cut, and then I'm going to finish with a jigsaw. Now this first bird's mouth cut was not too impressive, but it served its purpose. The heel cut's just fine over here, but over here on the seat cut, you can see that angle shows it was just a little wonky. Now with this dry fit, there are 2 things I'm looking for. First, is there enough space for the siding between the side of the top plate and that heel cut? And this is just a little tight. And the second thing I'm looking for is the amount of contact with the seat cut and the top of this plate. And the International Residential Code stipulates a 1.5 inch minimum bearing on the top plate. And you can see here, it's pretty close, but I wanted it more than that. So what that meant was I was going to have to take this heel cut further up the board. But then I decided rather than use my circular saw for that heel cut, I would use my miter saw and just set this vertical angle to 30 degrees. And I also set up a support block to make sure that the board remained level while I made this cut. And you can see here, I've got two support blocks behind the board being cut. And that's so that the full depth of the blade can get all the way through this rafter board. And then I'll still make the seat cut using a circular saw and finish off with the jigsaw. And this cut turned out a little better. Okay, and you can see here by comparison how much more contact there is between that bottom plate and the rafter. There's a full 2 3/4 inches of contact and plenty of support for the overhang as well. Alrighty, now it's time to put it all together. So just showing here that the top of the gusset is not above the top of the rafter board, so it doesn't interfere with the roof sheathing. And here I'm attaching the first gusset on one side. Then I'm going to go ahead and flip this over and attach the gusset to the second side. And here you can see I stacked them on one side of the shed in the order in which they'd be installed. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the nailing schedule is for gussets and rafters, but as you can see here, I got pretty happy with the nail gun. And here's the objective. 7 uniform rafters. You can see this first one has 1 gusset. The next 5 each have 2 gussets, and then the other end has just 1 gusset. Now I put this board at the end just to measure uniformity, but as you'll see later, I ended up trimming this overhang anyway. And here I'm adding some temporary vertical supports at each end of the shed for the end rafters. And now it's time to get that first rafter up. Now these rafters aren't very heavy, but it is important to keep one hand on each side of the rafter, unlike I'm doing right here. Otherwise, this is what happens. And so here I'm setting the rafter on the top plate in an inverted position. And then it's a simple flip to get it in the correct position. And then I'm attaching the rafter to the temporary vertical support using this clamp. And then once I've centered this rafter using that homemade plumb bob, I can attach this end rafter to the temporary supports. Okay, doing the same thing on the other side, but this time I've learned how to handle the rafter correctly. Okay, then just going to toenail in each of the 2 corners for each of these 2 end rafters. And here I'm just marking where each of the 5 other rafters will rest on these top plates. And then I'm going to go ahead and install this temporary horizontal support that will help me align the rafters as they are installed. And another guide I'm using is this string. This will help me align the peak of each of the 5 internal rafters. So I attach a small board to the top of each gable rafter and use screws for tying the string. Okay, now it's time to install the 5 internal rafters. So I'm going to begin by attaching these hurricane ties to the top plates. And for those of you who know how these are supposed to be installed, you know that this is the ID10T error. But hang tight with that, the details are coming up. Now, by installing these hurricane ties in ahead of time, it allowed me to more easily position these rafters on the top plate. And the use of the string at the top allowed me to easily align the peak of this rafter with the peaks of each of the gable rafters. And the horizontal support allowed me to screw in this upper part of the rafter at 24 inches on center at spots I had previously marked on the board. And then I'm just going to screw the hurricane ties into the rafter. Now, I chose to install my horizontal support on the top side of the rafters. One alternative would have been to install it on the underside of the rafters and then lift the rafter over the support. The downside of putting your horizontal support on the top is it creates a really tight fit on some of these rafters. And another advantage of putting your horizontal support on the underside of the rafters is you can leave it on while you're sheathing your roof. Alrighty, now it's time to dive into this ID10T error. And for those of you who are not familiar with an ID10T error, it's just another way to say idiot. So this is the way this Simpson H1 hurricane tie should be installed. These upper flanges should be toward the down slope of the rafter, not the up slope. And you can see here that I initially had installed them backwards. Now, would these have held the shed together installed backwards? Probably. Would they have passed inspection? Maybe. But I just didn't like having them installed backwards in my shed. Now, fortunately, rather than nailing these in, I used these Simpson number 9 1.5" SD connector screws, which means fixing this error was simply unscrewing and rescrewing 100 screws, which was time-consuming but not difficult. Now, the term idiot is a derogatory term, and I don't like to use it towards anybody, even myself, but I would like to point out the box of screws has a picture of the Simpson hurricane tie installed correctly, which is immediately obvious to the most casual observer. So yeah, I feel like idiot is appropriate here. Okay, and here's the objective. 7 uniformly designed rafters installed uniformly. And you can see here, those 7 peaks all align nicely. Now, while the H1 hurricane ties work well on the internal rafters, these end rafters need a different type of hurricane tie. Now, before that tie can be installed, the spacing needs to be filled in with this 2x4 and piece of OSB. And now this Simpson H2.5 hurricane tie can be installed. And here you can see how that additional spacing was filled in by that piece of OSB and the additional 2x4. Okay, so then I changed my fascia and soffit design, which meant I needed to trim the overhang for each rafter. So I put a nail in each of the end rafters and then drew a chalk line across all the rafters. Then I used my speed square and my level to draw a vertical line on the rafter right at the chalk line. Now, that vertical line I drew wasn't the cut line. Rather, that was the edge of this board that I clamped to the rafter, basically serving as a fence. Then, based on the position of the guard on my saw, the blade would actually cut about 1.25 inches away from that line. And here's the finished cut. Okay, one last cut to make, and that's this horizontal cut at the bottom of the rafter. And this is where the soffit will attach to the rafter. And here's a picture of the rafter after that cut. Okay, that wraps up this episode 5 of this shed build, which is to put together these rafters. Thank you for watching. Until next time.